Well, before I answer the questions, can I just say I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Taiwan. This is my first visit, and I've absolutely loved it. I'm about halfway through the tour now, and everyone has just been so kind. Mimi and the staff at the centre, absolutely wonderful, doing a great job. The teachers, the parents, the students that I've met have been fantastic, and it's really been great to be here. So wow, what an easy question to start with today. So yeah, the question about how do we improve our students' emotional sensitivity and the ability to connect. I don't think this is just a question for us as teachers. I think it's a question for society. We live in a society now with a phone, and of course what's happening is that the emotional experiences that we all have, but the young people, the young students that are coming through now, they're used to having very short, sharp experiences. We all know 30-second videos and so on. An example would be that young people, or most young people, enjoy going to a theme park, enjoy that 30-second thrill on a roller coaster, but don't necessarily invest in a film that might be 2.5 or 3 hours. So, to a certain extent, we as a society, what we need to be looking at, and certainly in the UK as a society, we're starting to look at the way that phones are used by young people. There's questions about should we ban the use of smartphones for children under 15. It's important that parents feel that they can contact their children by phone, but that doesn't necessarily need to be with a smartphone. So part of my work in the UK is linked to actually trying to reduce phone use with students. A lot of schools and colleges actually ban phones being brought in, or they restrict the use of them during the day. The problem that we have is that the phone has all our information. So we are, as a society, moving online. Schools are moving online. Timetables, information about the school day are online, and the students need to access it through their phones. So we have a strange mix, which is that we're trying to reduce the use of phones, but we're also trying to encourage students to get away from paper, and we haven't got that balance right yet. And I think if there's one last thing I'd say about it, it would be that the subjects of the arts, so music and drama in particular, are things that can really touch students, can really give them that emotional sensitivity. And because they enjoy that, they will then invest a little bit more. So certainly in education, we need to be focused on making sure that music and the arts in general are well funded. So I think this is an interesting question. I was taught by a gentleman who, when he had been taught the piano, if he didn't follow the music, the teacher would wrap his knuckles with a ruler. I think fortunately we don't live in a society like that any longer. I think there are some interesting things here. There's two words really, respect and motivation, and the two are linked together because I know that I was very fortunate that teachers that I had great respect for, and they motivated me to do well because I wanted to do well. And we as human beings want to be praised. Because nobody wants to be told off. We all want to be praised. And sometimes I think as teachers we need to realise that that it's more of the carrot and much less of the stick, particularly in the last 5, 6, 7 years where we've seen the motivation of young people change. So it's actually about understanding what is going on in their lives and connecting with them, creating a relationship. So I think that the relationship element, there's also the, we want the student to be enjoying what they're doing. And if the student is enjoying what they're doing, they're more likely to be motivated to practice. How do we make sure they're enjoying? We make sure that they're succeeding. If they feel that they're succeeding and they're gaining something, then they will be more motivated to practice. With my own students, one in particular, and this is quite a few years ago now, was my son, and I was teaching him piano, and it was hard work, but he turned the corner around about grade 3 piano when suddenly he got to use the sustaining pedal, and he thought this was wonderful because it opened up a tonal palette that he hadn't experienced before. And from that moment, he then actually practiced more. And then finally on it, I think it's also to do with the repertoire that we provide for the students. And we, as teachers, need to be careful that we don't become stuck in our ways and potentially just use what we've been taught. Because there's lots of different materials out there, lots of different resources that the students will enjoy. And there are ways, of course, to actually link to arrangements and to music that is popular back to the classical style, and actually to be able to link those together and say, well, if you look at this, you can see where the influence comes from, because this piece of Bach, you can see it in this piece here, and so on. Yeah, this is another interesting one. In my own experience, I've had success and failure with adult students. On the piano, with beginners, I've tried a variety of different techniques. I've tried, I had a student who I was teaching his daughter, and he decided he would learn the piano at the same time. And in order to keep things really simple, we just used the same book, which at that time his daughter was, I think, 7, and I was using piano time, and he learnt to play the piano through the piano time books as well. I currently have a student. I currently have an adult student who is in her 60s and works very slowly. But what I found with her was using the Hal Leonard adult tutorial books, which come with online recordings. That just provided her with an extra layer of help, because often an adult doesn't remember because there are too many other things going on in their lives. And this lady was a police officer and retired, and now runs her own business as well. So she doesn't have a lot of time, there's a lot going on in her life, and just having that, those recordings to play along with has been really helpful for her. And finally, I would just say it's the same as the motivation question that we just had. It's about relationships, and if you've got the right relationship, the student will flourish. And if the relationship isn't right, then the student's not going to flourish. So another interesting question, this one. I'm going to split it into 2 parts, really. For early music, so Baroque music and earlier than that, of course, there are, depending on which country you were in at the time, or which period, depended on what that particular sign meant. So there was a fluidity to ornamentation. Even Bach himself would use a variety of different ornaments, but they would mean different things at different times. So yes, in terms of the Baroque and earlier music, it's perfectly possible to change some of that ornamentation. So dealing with that, with regard to exams, how does that impact if you've had to change things? And this is something that I'll probably come back to quite a few times this afternoon, which is that it's about the musical outcome. If the musical outcome is successful, then whatever you change in the music is fine. However, if the musical outcome is not successful through what you have done, then that will have an impact. So, for example, and we've got a question coming up later about this, about hand sizes and octaves and things like that. If it has a musical impact, then yes, that will have an impact on marks. And the same with, if you're simplifying, for example, ornamentation in some Mozart or Haydn, if it does something to retract some of the style from that performance, then yes, that is going to have an impact. Yeah, so quite often in the urtext editions, there's no articulation markings at all, so we have to try and work it out. Here, I think the general guideline is that if you think that it musically works, then that will be successful. I think we've got to, as teachers, use our own knowledge, our own training, and also do our own research. It's very straightforward these days to gather that information, and also through recordings as well. It's very easy on a phone to just quickly bring up our recording and actually let a student hear a professional performance, so they get an understanding of what that articulation is. And we as teachers obviously can recognise it much easier and demonstrate it as well. And just to finish this, what I would say is that where a composer has left information, articulation markings, or any sense of dynamics, then yes, we should be following those, because those are part of the composer's instructions to us as performers. I would just also say, just in terms of this, because this is something that I do talk about quite frequently in exams, which is that articulation is not, in Baroque music, is not just about playing it detached. It's about the weight and the length of the note, because we take into account that a lot of keyboard music at that time, of course, would not have been played on an expressive instrument. It would have been played on a harpsichord or a clavichord or an organ. And even the early pianos wouldn't have had much of a dynamic range. So just remember that, of course, we're talking about the weight and the length of notes, and pointing to those strong beats. I think the best bit of advice I was ever given about Baroque articulation was being told to imagine playing on the violin and playing separate bows. So I'm not aware of any changes coming to the ARSM. I don't see any changes. I think it's an exam that's now fixed. We've had it for quite some time. It was the basis for the performance grades, which we'll come on to talk about as well. Guidelines for repertoire selection. On the ABRSM website, there are guidelines there in terms of telling you what you can include and what you can't, but also suggestions as to the fact that you want obviously to have a balanced programme. Remember, it is a performance diploma. It's not like the practical grades, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. And of course, as teachers and performers, we understand what a balanced programme looks like. So it's important that when we're putting those together, that the programme is balanced. Part of this question also talks about the total performance duration in terms of the times. It's absolutely vital you get the timings right, because there is a penalty if you are under or if you're over. You need to be within that range. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's on the website. You have to be within that. I think it's 2 minutes either side, isn't it?
30 minutes.
Yeah. So you need to be within that. So it's absolutely vital that you actually time the performance, including any breaks or in between pieces. And a story about timings, which isn't related to exams, but is related to performance, which was that I, many years ago, was taking part in a live radio broadcast, and we had to give timings, and I gave timings from what I thought was a very fast performance from a CD of a piece that took about 4 minutes to play. And when they did the timings for the in the rehearsal for the broadcast, I was playing it at 3 minutes. There's nothing specific for grade 8, but there are specifics for any of the performance grade video recordings. First thing is obviously when you actually put the application in, please make sure that you actually put down what the pieces are, because of course you don't need to show us the pieces any longer or announce them. And I did have a performance grid quite recently where it was, I think, about a grade 6, 7 piano, can't remember, and there were no pieces written down for me. So as each piece started, I had to frantically go through the iPad, stop the video and work out what piece it was. Now some of them were easy, but some of them were not. Had that been a singer, where we don't actually have extracts on the iPad, I wouldn't have been able to examine it. So that's the first thing. Next, make sure that the camera, obviously you can see the keyboard if it's a keyboard instrument. Ideally, if there's an accompanist, you want to see the accompanist as well. In terms of your recording, once you've done it, please check it. Because I've had a few performance grades where the recording quality has been so poor that I've not been able to examine. And that includes the very top grades. I remember a grade 8 tuba I couldn't examine because the quality was so poor. So check it, do a test quickly before you actually start to make the recording. Also for the performance grade video recordings, remember it is a performance grade. And performance isn't just about playing the pieces. Performance is about deportment, it's about how the candidate moves between the pieces, how they end the piece, how they start the next piece, how they interact with the camera, i.e. you, the audience, I'm talking about me, the examiner, as well. The best performances that I see are the ones where the candidate actually talks to the camera. The worst ones are usually when the candidate doesn't even look at the camera at any point, and it's the teacher who is introducing. And if you look at the criteria for the performance grades, communication. So if there's no communication, it's going to bring the mark down. So this is obviously linked to the previous question. And first thing to say is, I think we should all be aware, obviously, that the 4 pieces must be recorded in one single recording. You can't record each individual piece and then piece it together. So that's the first thing, it must be a complete performance. How should the 4 pieces be presented? As a performance, as it would be if we were performing here on this stage. So it's important that we teach our students not just how to play the notes, but that communication element that's the performance as a whole. What happens when you finish that piece? There needs to be a time when the room still has that atmosphere. And then we relax, then we turn the page. Too often we see and hear a performance where it comes to an end, it's abrupt. Next page, on to the next piece. Communication, again, this will move that down a little bit. And just to bring that section to a close, 2 very short stories about my experiences of performance grades. One was an interesting exam where the candidate was sat on a stool in the hallway of her house playing the clarinet, and the accompanist was in the room next door. So, what criteria do we use? This criteria is published, it's available to you. In fact, you've got it there. So, for example, if you look at the pieces criteria. You can see it's split up into 5 areas: pitch, time, tone, shape and performance. And we use this for practical grids and performance grids. This is the criteria that we use for the pieces. It's obviously quite fluid because all candidates will be at different levels through all of the criteria. So, as an example, we could have a candidate who comes in and plays highly accurate notes and intonation. It's absolutely not perfect. They might have a sustained effective tempo and the rhythm is good. And we can see already just in those 2 basic elements that we've got one that's sitting in the distinction box and we've got one that's sitting in the merit box. So to that then, we look at tone, and for example, this candidate's tone might be uneven and or unreliable or inadequate. So that is below pass. And so we can see that what we're actually doing when we mark, we're starting at 0, but not going up, or when I say starting at 0, sorry, that's wrong. We're starting at 100, we're starting at pass, and we're then deciding, does it go up, does it go down, where does it go? So we're not starting at 0 and adding marks, and we're not starting at 150 and taking marks off. So we're starting at 100. So this candidate, as we've been through, saying that the notes are highly accurate, the rhythm is pretty good, but the tone is poor. Now, quite often, when we come across poor tone or poor tonal control, that will usually mean that the idea of shaping will be actually quite difficult for that candidate, no matter what instrument, because if they haven't got the tonal control right, they're going to really struggle to do things like put a crescendo in, diminuendo, to shape it, for example. Now that's not to say that we're penalising the candidate because they've got poor tone. What we're saying is that we're marking to that criteria. That candidate is unable to provide any shape or sufficient musical detail. So that's the criteria for pieces. In terms of the criteria for the supporting tests, again, it's published there. I think what is interesting is the criteria for the performance grades, where for the performance as a whole, and this includes ARSM, we've got different set of criteria that we use just for that one bit. So we're looking at the performance as a whole, not individual pieces. And we're looking at obviously their communication, interpretation and delivery. So delivery is the technical aspects. Technically, how did you play? Was the tone good? Did you play all the right notes? Did you play them in the right time? Was your pedaling on the piano effective? The interpretation element is, what about the stylistic features? So, for example, was your articulation in that piece of Bach, was it suitable? Did it add to the piece? Was the rubato in the Chopin, for example, was that balanced? So we're looking at different aspects as the performance of as a whole. And I've been examining now for over 30, nearly 30 years, and I'm experienced enough to be able to kind of pinpoint 99% of the time where that mark is based on my experience. But there will be days when I'm candidates where I'm really struggling to think, where does this sit? And I always go back to the criteria and I'll work my way through it, and I'll basically put my fingers in each box where I think the candidate is, and then work from there in terms of where's that mark going to be. And it's important to say that that criteria is publicly available. It's on the website. You can look at it. An interesting bit here, of course, is right at the bottom of the criteria for the supporting tests, that you'll see that it says that if nothing is offered, then it's 0. But the next band is 7 marks.
No.
So if your candidate comes in and plays one single note on their sight reading, they'll get 7 marks. I'm not sure I'm supposed to have told you that, but it is publicly available. So again, it comes down to what is the musical outcome? Does it work? So what is likely to happen is that what's likely to happen is that if it doesn't work, if the examiner thinks it doesn't work, they'll make a comment about something else. They won't comment usually that you didn't play the octaves there, or there were notes missing in the chords or whatever. It will be something along the lines of that there was insecurity potentially, or tone, for example. Tone was uneven. We might talk about because we don't have the music in front of us. We have a very 2 or 3 bars where that just shows the start of a piece of music. So it will come down to, is it effective? So it's all about the musical outcome. A good example would be the Mozart rondo that's on grade 8 piano syllabus with the octaves on the right hand. If you've got a candidate that can't manage those, then you might want to simplify it, but that might have an impact on the, for example, the texture of the piece if you're only playing single notes rather than octaves. The answer is twofold. Practical grades has no impact whatsoever, none whatsoever. You could choose 3 pieces that are almost identical. We just mark the pieces. We're not marking a performance at practical grade. It's how well the piece is performed. Now the second part of that is performance grade. Yes, it has an impact, particularly the choice, the own choice piece. You don't have obviously much choice when you're choosing the 3 from the syllabus, but in the performance grades when you choose that 4th, think carefully about what you need to balance that as a programme, because it's marked on the criteria performance as a whole, because it's part of the communication and interpretation and delivery. So choose the 4th piece carefully so that it balances. You don't need to play the pieces in the order of the set in the syllabus. Choose them and arrange them in the best order that gives you the most balanced programme. With regard to ARSM, where there is much more flexibility in terms of choosing the repertoire, again, think about things that will show a balanced programme, and also music that ideally shows off your candidate as well. And just the last thing I'd say there is that choose repertoire that suits your candidate. If you've got a candidate that's got small hands and can't play octaves, well, don't play music that requires a lot of octave playing. Choose something that will demonstrate you have that flexibility in the ARSM. So obviously the performance grade appeared during COVID, and its purpose was essentially to give the world music exams in some shape or form, and we were very fortunate that the ARSM had appeared a few years earlier, because that was the model. 4 pieces, essentially 4 pieces. Not necessarily 4 pieces in the ARSM, but using the criteria. So it was already built. What is the purpose of it now? I think, for me personally, how I use it with my students, and I do a mix of practical and performance grades. So I tend to use the performance grades for students who have learnt all the repertoire, but the exam session is not due for another month or 2 months away, and I know that having reached the peak, they're going to start to dip. So I will use the performance grades for that. I still teach them all the scales and all the supporting tests, and I always have a 4th piece when we're working those practical grade pieces. I always have a 4th piece at the side should we decide to go down the performance grade. And I've got students that just jump between back and forward. So I've got grade 1, they've done performance grade, but grade 2, they've done practical grade. So yeah, it's that, but it's also about choice, and also that some candidates really do struggle in that exam environment. So being able to actually do it as a recording, as a performance, is actually more beneficial to them, rather than, I suppose no students particularly like scales, but we all know as teachers that they're the foundation for playing, and we still want to have those, but we have to also, I suppose, recognise that for some of our students, walking into that exam room with somebody that they don't know, an examiner, is quite a scary environment. And we are all lovely as examiners. We have the saying that we're told, I think, every year when we meet as examiners at conferences for training, is that it's our job to do our best so that you, the candidate, can do your best. We're facilitators. Can I just say, before we finish, can I say a huge thank you to Mimi and our staff for putting this on today. I can't tell you the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes. And so thank you very much for everything you've done. Thank you all for coming. I'm more than happy to stay behind and answer any questions that you've got.